Hi, this is Joe from Xclusive Autosound. I'm here to show you the differences and why we don't heat shrink T-taps. There's a couple stores in the area making a big deal about why heat shrink is the big thing to have these days. Well, let me show you exactly why you should not. So a standard T connection that most remote starts use. So imagine this is an ignition wire in the car, and you wrap your wire around the ignition wire as such. And then what they do in order to get the heat shrink on the film or on the wire itself is they then take this wire and they bend it in half. Then they solder the wire here, and then they slide the heat shrink over the wire, so a wire ends up like that and you have a T connection. The reason why this is not a great idea is first of all, it would normally be soldered. You're stretching a piece of heat shrink that needs to be the size of this wire over a size of the wire that's twice the size. What happens when you solder these wires, every once in a while a little barb is going to stick out like such, and when you solder that, that barb gets hard. So an installer generally, when they push the heat shrink over the material and they go to heat shrink the material out with a lighter, so when they light it down like this, the heat shrink will shrink, and then that barb where they didn't solder the wire perfectly smooth, and I've seen it happen 3-4 dozen times, will stick out the side of the heat shrink. And the installer is in such a hurry that they won't even go back and check, which is exactly why we don't do it this method whatsoever. The next problem is that, hey, you had a wire. Let's see if I can get this off here now. You had a wire that was this long before, and now with the heat shrink on it, it's about 1.5 inches shorter. Where are they getting the extra slack in the wire? Well, what they're doing is they're pulling on the wire, and car manufacturers these days are making the wire harnesses just long enough to get where they need to go. So they got to pull that slack from somewhere in order to get the heat shrink over the top of the wiring connector. Well, they're putting a lot of extra stress on the connectors that plug in the ignition switches, the BCMs, the ECUs of the car, and it can give pin fatigue. It can actually make the pin come out of where it needs to be plugged into, and then your car has several more problems than it had before. How we do it here at Xclusive Autosound is we pretty much just do a T-tap, as we always have for the last 20 years. It's never failed us once. It's worked every single time for a couple of reasons. So a generally T-tap, you take a wire, I would put it in the middle of this, and you rotate it around, then you would solder it up. And when you solder it up, then we only use 3M 33 plus tape. It's the best electrical tape on the market. I've been using it for the last 20 years. It's rock solid. It's held up. Every car I've seen that I've ever worked on has worked out. The nice thing about this is if you get a metal barb on the soldering, when you're wrapping your tape around it, you can feel that metal barb, and then you can adjust. If you need to pinch the barb down, you push it down with the things, and you can rotate through to make a solid connection. Because when you're making these connections, you're not just making one of them, you're making 5 or 6 right next to each other typically. So what happens if there's a barb sticking out, you don't know it because you just heat shrunk it and you go on your way down to the next thing, and that barb is going to make contact with something it's not supposed to make contact with and blow a fuse or so on. This way it pretty much eliminates that problem altogether. It's a permanent connection. It's never ever going to come apart. Like I said, it would obviously be soldered before, and you'll never have any issues with your car whatsoever. No pin fatigue, no failure on the car part whatsoever. And to top it all off, generally those guys will make the problem of shortening the wire even worse by putting a zip tie around it as such, with the heat shrink over the wire that I already pulled off, and the wire becomes even shorter. The reason why they do this is because the tendency of it want to pull apart pulls the heat shrink off the joint over time, and then you have a bare connection altogether, no heat shrink whatsoever. And the last thing why this is a terrible idea, because installers believe, hey, I got to do this as fast as possible. They're not going to use a little lighter to light the heat shrink to get it to shrink. They're using these blow torches, butane power blow torches, and they're melting everything in the vicinity of this heat shrink around it while they're trying to heat this heat shrink together to get the perfect connection. It's just an overall bad idea. So that's why this way is the best way. Anyone that tells you heat shrink on a T-tap connection is absolutely wrong and would never ever go that route whatsoever. T-tap or heat shrink on a butt connection where 2 wires come together, on the other hand, it's professional. It looks great. You still have to worry about the barb coming through on the heat shrink and whatnot, but it's still clean. It looks good. But we still here at Xclusive Autosound use 33 plus for the pure reason that you can feel for the barbs. I've done harnesses for 20 years. They look clean, just as clean wrapped this way as they do in heat shrink.